Josh Ward, what do you think about me keep doing the show in the Tony Bennett voice? And I'll tell you one thing, when it comes to Tony Bennett, it sounds so simple, but if you just be yourself, you're different than anyone else.
Well, when are you going to start doing the Tony Bennett voice?
It's actually a weak Alec Baldwin doing Tony Bennett is what that essentially was.
Yeah. I'd give it a C+ for effort. If we're going to start there, if we're going to grade on the performance, I would hand you back your paper and say, why don't we work it a little bit more?
Yeah. Every day feels like just starting out because I have so much more to learn.
Josh Davis coping because the Celtics gave Jaylen Brown and Max Steele, and he's so upset about it.
That wasn't right. All right, let's talk some Tennessee offensive line. Josh Wood, you crazy cat. And that is Tennessee's offensive line has a habit in the offseason of switching things around. Josh wrote about the offensive line. It worked with Darnell Wright from left tackle to right tackle. They're going to do something similar this year. Talk about Tennessee's offensive line as we're just a couple of days away from camp opening.
One thing that stood out to me at SEC Media Days was talking to Jim Nagy, the executive director of the Senior Bowl, because he talked about that right tackle position where Tennessee has to replace Darnell Wright. And Tennessee has made a move again with Gerald Mincey, who played left tackle last season, started more than half the games, and he will now project as the starting right tackle. Still has to go out there and earn it. J.J. Crawford is going to compete at that position, but Mincey is the projected starter at right tackle, and I would expect that he will be in that position. And Nagy said that they have an NFL mid-round grade on Mincey as a draft prospect, and that NFL teams like what they've seen from Mincey, who has not played a ton. He was a reserve at Florida, transferred to Tennessee, as I mentioned, started more than half the games, but has not started a full season, dealt with some injury last year. He's also making that move. How does that affect how he plays? That's a question Nagy had, and I'm sure NFL teams have, about how he'll perform from 22 to 23. It did work out great for Darnell Wright, and perhaps Mincey plays at an even higher level. So I'm not going to sit here and say that Mincey will play like Darnell Wright. That would be an unfair expectation for, honestly, anybody on the team, let alone just the offensive lineman that we're talking about, because Wright was terrific and made his way up into the top 10 of the NFL draft. But if Mincey is able to play at a level that NFL teams believe he's capable of, then Tennessee can play winning football with Mincey there at right tackle, and it will go a long way in having to replace Wright, who played a huge role in Tennessee winning 11 games, winning the Alabama game. We've talked about what Hendon Hooker and Jalen Hyatt have done or did in that game. They don't do all that without Darnell Wright protecting against Will Anderson, a top 3 pick in the NFL draft.
I was talking to Jim, too. We were talking about the executive director of the Senior Bowl. I was talking to him last week at SEC Media Days, and Darnell Wright practically wasn't on their board, which is kind of crazy. Part of that was the switch, but they just didn't think that Wright was that good, which if I'm Josh Heupel, I'm telling every offensive line prospect that listens.
Sure. Wright was a guy that was very highly touted as a prospect. He was a highly regarded 5-star player out of West Virginia, and he played a lot his first 2 seasons at Tennessee, but not at a high level, and played well enough to show that, yeah, he's a starter in the SEC in 2021, but man, did he jump up in 2022. And I think part of that is his physical ability. He is naturally gifted as a tackle. The move to right tackle may have been better for him as compared to other players trying to make that move. Glenn Ellerbe is also a good offensive line coach. He's been successful everywhere he's been. He also has worked for several years now with Josh Heupel, so they have a connection in terms of what Ellerbe is doing as a coach and what the system is that Josh Heupel is running. But Mincey was a guy that, leaving Florida, I don't know that the Gators were all that concerned about losing him. And now we're talking about him projecting as an NFL draft prospect, and he might be at the Senior Bowl at the end of this year. So I just thought that was really interesting that Mincey is a guy that NFL teams are talking about more than I feel like we're talking about discussing Tennessee on a daily basis, and having to replace Darnell Wright, which is one of the biggest offseason questions. To me, it's a much bigger question than having to replace Jalen Hyatt, or even going in personnel-wise, having to replace Hendon Hooker. We know Joe Milton is the guy. Now it's, can he go out and perform? At right tackle, I think the offseason began with, okay, who who is the guy? Is it for sure Mincey? And now we're talking about Mincey as an NFL draft prospect if this year goes well.
Be sure and click on that like button. Subscribe if you haven't at this point. Get your notifications on. Looking at T. Martin and Darwin Walker. The Celebrate 98 series continues. Portions of the program brought to you by City Heating and Air Conditioning, cityheatandair.com. 50 years in East Tennessee. Integrity matters. Calhoun?
Yeah, Josh, it's funny because I'm with you. I don't think we're emphasizing enough the difficulties of replacing Darnell Wright, because isn't the question, it's we're talking about whether or not Gerald Mincey can do his job at right tackle. But isn't there a difference between doing your job and being able to fill that void and doing what Darnell Wright did, which is, in my opinion, I got to be honest, I think Darnell Wright is between him and Aaron Sears in terms of the best offensive lineman for Tennessee this century, quite honestly. And I know that's a crazy thing to say, but there's a huge gap between those two factors, right?
Sure. That's why I said replacing Darnell in terms of how he played is not a realistic conversation. That he didn't allow a sack last year. I would expect that Mincey's going to allow somebody to get to the quarterback. You also have a different quarterback back there in Joe Milton versus Hendon Hooker. But I do also think there's a gap between if Mincey plays at a level that NFL teams value and say, okay, we want to draft this guy, versus what we've seen in prior years from Tennessee at the tackle position. There were several seasons where it was rough. 2 years ago, Tennessee was at the bottom of the SEC in sacks allowed. So they cleaned things up from where they were 2 years ago to being, I think, middle of the pack in that stat, which was a big jump from where they were the year before, and it allowed the offense to make a jump from being top 10 in the nation in scoring offense, which is really good, to being the best over the course of the season. So I expect a step back from what they produced with Darnell Wright, but I expect a step back at the edge position for Alabama with Will Anderson being on. I also expect Alabama still to be really good defensively, and I expect Tennessee will be better than maybe we collectively feared in the conversation the day that we knew Darnell Wright was moving on to the NFL.
I was asking a Nashville station who's the bubble wrap guy. And what I mean by that is a guy that you just can't get injured. He can't get hurt. And when you pick that guy, Josh, because I'm curious if we'll pick the same guy, take into account depth behind him. Okay, so, I mean, Squirrel White, we all love him, and Dante Thornton, but there is some depth there. I actually went with the offensive line, and I went with Cooper Mays. What did you think of that? What do you think of that?
I almost interrupted you to say Cooper Mays. I don't hesitate. There are a lot of guys that are really valuable, but I can also come up with a contingency plan if they lose players at other positions. Like Aaron Beasley, I think he's really valuable at linebacker, but I can figure out at least pretty quickly what they're going to do and not worry as much with some of the unproven depth that is there, and guys like Elijah Herring and then Arion Carter, who's a freshman, but man, they love what they've seen from him. Losing Brew McCoy would be no good at all. I also wouldn't lose confidence in Tennessee staff's ability to get production at that receiver position, plus other guys in different spots. Addison Nichols could step in there and be just fine, and maybe I'm wrong here. But if they lost Cooper and had to go to Addison, I would worry immediately. Even at quarterback, it'd be a big question, but that position is always different. And you do have such a talented player in Nico, who is there as a backup with all of his skills. So, yeah, I would put Cooper number one in the most difficult player to replace list, and then I would leave a space at number two, and then I'd start the rest of the list at number three.
Josh, I want to ask you a little bit, moving into the inside of the line. I spoke with Cole Kublik last week, and he said when Tennessee was running their offense last year, he was consistently watching Javonte Spraggins over anybody else. And I feel like we don't talk about him enough, that he was an all-SEC guy. There seems to be oh, did we lose Josh?
No, it's the guy that he popped away for some reason, but he's right back. All right, there, he's back for some reason. All right.
I'm hardwired in, too. What's going on here?
Is it me, or I feel like there's superstar potential for Spraggins at guard? I mean, we could he be like the guard version of Darnell Wright this year?
I love Cole talking about Spraggins, by the way, so I love that you bring that up. I referenced Cole in the column that I wrote at Off the Hook Sports. And if you search Cole's name and Spraggins' name on Twitter, you'll see Cole inviting the public open invitation for anybody that wants to join the Spraggins fan club. So when Cole makes that kind of compliment, and he was a guy that told everybody, look, Trey Smith doesn't get enough attention. And he said, NFL teams, what are you doing? Draft Trey Smith. So that is where Cole kind of comes from in terms of his evaluation of offensive linemen, including at Tennessee. There are some areas where Spraggins needs to be better. That Georgia game did not go great last season. But you can also pull up the Kentucky game where a lot of the attention is on, big plays and the defense completely destroying Kentucky's offense, which deserves all the attention it's received. But if you pull up the offensive line and watch the way they dominated Kentucky's guys, Spraggins is a part of that. And that shows his upside of what he's able to do. And the starting point of where you should feel best about Tennessee's offensive line this year is Cooper at center and the guy right next to him, Javonte Spraggins. The other quote I included in there, at least part of the response from Jerome Carvin when he joined us on the radio a couple of weeks ago, was Spraggins is a wild man. And the way that he plays is what you're looking for in terms of the mentality and how physical he's going to be at guard. And Tennessee's going to continue to run the football in this offense. As much as we talk about the passing game, and again should, the running game is a huge part of what Tennessee always does and will again this year. And Spraggins is going to be a big part of that. So some of the offseason talk of, hey, maybe Spraggins is a first-round pick. Maybe he is by the end of the season. I don't know that that's fair right now, but he is absolutely an NFL draft prospect, and he's a big part of why this offensive line can still be fine this year.